Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be looking at the recent conflict in Gaza and kind of seeing, how it's impacted things globally. We've got a really interesting mix of sources for this one social media posts, legal documents, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, some international news reports.
Exactly.
And we're even going to touch on some insights from a Brazilian court, which is where things take a pretty interesting turn.
That's kind of our hook for today, the Brazilian connection.
Absolutely. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
Especially when we're thinking about legal accountability and the role that technology plays in all of this.
Absolutely. Okay. So you've provided some, really heartbreaking accounts from Palestinian sources. They're reporting over 45,800 casualties and that the territory is almost completely destroyed.
Yeah, it's just devastating.
Yeah. But amidst all this, we see this story emerge about an Israeli soldier who's been accused of war crimes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So in this case, we see the Hein Rajab Foundation. They're also known as the HRF. It's a pro-Palestinian group. And they're using videos and photos they found online to essentially build their case against this soldier.
Wow.
The images are pretty striking. They show homes being demolished in Gaza. So it's a powerful example of how social media is really, changing the game, so to speak. It's becoming this tool, not just for documenting what's happening, but, potentially even bringing those responsible to justice.
It's amazing how they used it, really. And then a Brazilian federal court decides to assert jurisdiction over this case and even orders police action. Did you see that coming?
It's pretty unprecedented.
Yeah.
In fact, the HRF president, Diab Abu Jaja, called it a historic moment.
It's pretty strong.
Yeah, and it all hinges on this concept of universal jurisdiction.
Oh, okay.
So it's this idea that some crimes, like genocide or war crimes,
Yeah.
are just so horrific that any nation can prosecute them no matter now where they happen.
So it doesn't matter where they occurred?
Right? It's like this global agreement that some acts are just unacceptable.
Regardless of borders.
Regardless of borders, exactly.
Wow. Okay. So then how did Israel react to all of this?
Well, they acted fast.
Yeah.
They helped the soldier leave Brazil before he could be detained.
Interesting.
Which kind of shows you how sensitive they are to this sort of legal scrutiny.
Right.
Especially outside their own borders.
Outside their own borders. It's like they were trying to head off like a potential international incident. And then their foreign ministry, they issued this warning to soldiers about what they post online, stressing how social media activity could land them in legal trouble.
Yeah, for sure. It was a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah.
That what you do online can have, very real consequences in the real world.
Like even on an international scale.
Exactly.
Wow. Now, turning to Israel internally, opposition leader Yair Lapid, he's been pretty vocal in his criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision not to launch an inquiry commission into the war. Lapid even said that the Palestinians were outmaneuvering the Israeli government internationally. Do you think there's any validity to that?
It's interesting, right? Because I think Lapid's critique, it really highlights the internal politics within Israel and how that can impact their standing in the world. Yeah. So it raises the question, could they be, maybe underestimating the importance of diplomacy in navigating this complex legal and political landscape?
It's a really good point. So while all this is going on, South Africa formally accuses Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice.
Right.
And the International Criminal Court, or ICC, issues arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. What are your thoughts on those developments?
It's pretty serious stuff. And Israel has denied these accusations, calling them, distorted and anti-Semitic. But regardless of the outcome, I think these legal actions show how international law is increasingly being used, to address these conflicts and try to hold individuals accountable.
Absolutely. I think it's incredible how quickly the HRF was able to put together that 400-page dossier using all that social media evidence.
Right.
They did it in just 3 days.
It's amazing.
That's amazing. What does that tell us about the role of technology in this kind of conflict?
Well, it just highlights how technology is changing everything, right? How quickly information spreads and how accessible it is. The speed at which they compile that dossier is remarkable. It makes you wonder if international legal systems are getting better at holding individuals accountable. How might that impact military strategies and the behavior of soldiers on the ground in the future?
Yeah, that's a really...
What do you think?
It's a lot to think about. But with all this talk about legal maneuvering and political strategies, I think it's crucial to remember the human cost of this conflict. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is catastrophic, and so many lives have been impacted by the violence and the devastation.
You're absolutely right. It's so easy to get caught up in all the legal and political debates and lose sight of the individuals who are caught in the middle of it all.
Yeah.
And ultimately, any attempt at achieving justice, it has to address that urgent need for peace and reconciliation if we want to prevent even more suffering.
Exactly. And that's a good point to end on, I think, for this section. But we will be back to discuss this in more detail in our next segment.
Yeah, it really highlights the challenge of finding that balance between, pursuing justice while also creating a space for dialogue and working towards a lasting peace. It's a tough one. It's something the international community grapples with constantly.
And it seems like in this case, social media is adding like a whole other layer to that challenge.
Yeah.
But we had talked about how it's being used as evidence. But what about its impact on like shaping public perception and influencing the political conversation?
Right, that's a crucial point. Like the way the HRF used social media to gather that evidence and build their case, it really shows how, non-state actors can leverage these platforms to reach a global audience.
Yeah.
And, potentially influence how a conflict is perceived.
Yeah.
It's a kind of soft power.
Yeah.
And it can be really effective. Especially when, traditional media outlets might be limited or biased in their coverage.
It's like this democratization of information in a way. Like anybody with a smartphone can be a citizen journalist, documenting events in real time, sharing their perspective with the world. But of course, that also raises concerns about misinformation and propaganda, which we've seen play out in so many conflicts.
Absolutely. And the ease with which information can spread, both accurate and inaccurate, it makes it even more important to develop those critical thinking skills and be discerning about the sources we rely on. We need to be aware of potential biases, hidden agendas, the possibility of manipulation.
So what does all of this mean for the future of conflict resolution? If social media is becoming such a powerful tool, both for documenting these potential crimes, but also shaping public opinion, how do we ensure that it's used responsibly and ethically?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it requires a multifaceted approach. For starters, the platforms themselves, they need to take more responsibility for moderating content, combating misinformation, preventing the spread of hate speech. But it's not just on the tech companies. Governments, international organizations, civil society, they all have a role to play in promoting media literacy, fostering dialogue, establishing ethical guidelines for how social media is used in these situations.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. No easy answers. But it definitely demands our attention. And while we're on the topic of accountability, we got to circle back to those accusations of genocide against Israel. I mean, these are incredibly serious allegations, and they've sparked intense debate within the international community. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's important to understand, the legal definition of genocide. It involves the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It's a high bar to meet. And proving intent is often really challenging in these legal proceedings.
Right. And Israel vehemently denies these accusations, framing them as politically motivated attacks aimed at, delegitimizing the state. They argue that their actions in Gaza were necessary to defend themselves against Hamas, which they consider a terrorist organization.
Right. And it's crucial to acknowledge both perspectives, I think.
Yeah.
And understand the historical context. This conflict, it's rooted in decades of territorial disputes, political tensions, violence. There's a deep well of mistrust and animosity on both sides. And that makes it incredibly difficult to find common ground and work towards a peaceful solution.
And it's the people of Gaza who ultimately bear the brunt of this conflict. We've seen reports of, widespread destruction, displacement, a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It's a stark reminder that beyond the legal battles and political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this. And their stories deserve to be heard, and their needs must be addressed.
Absolutely. So as we delve deeper into these complexities, I'm curious to get your take on this concept of universal jurisdiction, the Brazilian court's decision to assert jurisdiction over the Israeli soldiers' case, unprecedented. And it raises some intriguing questions about the evolving nature of international law.
Yeah, universal jurisdiction. It's a fascinating legal principle, but it's also incredibly controversial. On the one hand, it reflects this, growing international consensus that some crimes just so heinous, so fundamentally opposed to the values of humanity, that any nation has a moral obligation to prosecute them, no matter where they occurred, or the nationality of the perpetrator.
So it's like a global safety net, ensuring that even if a country is unwilling or unable to hold its own citizens accountable for atrocities, the international community can step in and seek justice.
Precisely. It's a powerful tool for
Yeah.
holding individuals accountable, deterring future crimes,
Yep.
upholding international norms. But it's not without its critics, of course.
Right.
Some argue that it can be used selectively, often targeting individuals from weaker states, while those from powerful nations enjoy impunity.
There's also the concern that it could be used as a tool for like political grandstanding or interference in the internal affairs of other countries.
Absolutely. And that's why the application of universal jurisdiction, it needs to be carefully considered, based on solid legal grounds and clear evidence, rather than political motivations. It's a delicate balance between upholding justice and respecting national sovereignty.
And in the case of the Israeli soldier, it seems like the Brazilian court's decision was more symbolic than anything else. He was able to leave the country before any legal action could be taken.
True, but the symbolism is still significant. It sends a message that individuals who commit war crimes, even in distant lands, may not be able to escape accountability entirely. It reinforces the idea that international law has teeth, even if those teeth can sometimes be slow to bite.
That's a great way to put it. It's a fascinating development, and one that I'm sure will continue to be debated within legal circles for years to come. But for now, let's kind of shift gears and talk about the internal political dynamics within Israel. You mentioned earlier that opposition leader Yair Lapid was critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu's handling of the conflict. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so Lapid's critique, it centers on Netanyahu's refusal to establish an independent inquiry commission to investigate the war, which Lapid argues could actually help shield Israel from international legal scrutiny. He believes that by failing to conduct a thorough and transparent internal investigation, Israel's leaving itself vulnerable to accusations of cover-ups and a lack of accountability.
So it's a matter of perception as well, like Lapid suggesting that even if Israel's actions were justified, failing to adequately address potential wrongdoing could damage their reputation on the global stage.
Exactly. It's a strategic blunder in his view. By not taking the initiative to investigate potential misconduct, Israel is kind of ceding control of the narrative to international bodies like the ICC, which could lead to more damaging accusations and legal actions down the line.
It's like this fascinating political chess match, with each side making these calculated moves to protect their interests and shape the narrative surrounding the conflict. And it seems like, in this case, the Palestinians are gaining some ground on the international stage, at least in terms of garnering sympathy and support for their cause.
That's a key takeaway from this whole situation, I think, like the HRF's success in bringing the Israeli soldiers' case to the attention of a Brazilian court.
Yeah.
Even if it didn't ultimately result in his arrest, it demonstrates their growing ability to leverage these international legal mechanisms and public opinion to pressure Israel. It's a sign that the balance of power in this conflict, at least on the diplomatic front, it might be shifting.
And it's a testament to the power of technology and social media in amplifying their voices and connecting them with a global audience. It's a game changer, really, allowing these non-state actors to bypass traditional diplomatic channels and directly appeal to public opinion.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool. But as we've discussed, it also comes with risks. Social media can easily be used to spread misinformation, propaganda, hate speech. It's a double-edged sword, and it's crucial to use it responsibly and ethically.
Absolutely. That's a point worth emphasizing as we, navigate this increasingly interconnected and digitized world where information spreads at lightning speed and traditional power structures are being challenged. We need to develop a more nuanced understanding of the role technology plays in conflict resolution. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape, and it demands our careful consideration.
Yeah, it really is fascinating, this whole idea that technology can both escalate these conflicts, but also be a powerful tool for resolving them. It all comes down to how it's used and who's using it. Out of all the sources that you shared with us today, I mean, what really stands out to you when you consider the role of technology in this conflict? Well, I think it's amazing how, 1 minute we're looking at how social media fuels the spread of misinformation, and then the next, it's being used as evidence in a courtroom, halfway across the world. Technology is definitely reshaping how we understand and respond to conflict. It's something to keep a close eye on, for sure.
It brings us back to this fundamental question, though. What does true justice actually look like in a situation like this? I mean, is it about holding individuals accountable for specific crimes, or is it more about tackling these broader systemic issues that have fueled this conflict for so long? What are your thoughts on that?
That's the core question, isn't it? And I think the answer is it has to be both. You can't have one without the other. Achieving justice requires this like multi-layered approach. We have to hold perpetrators accountable. But we also have to acknowledge the historical injustices, address the root causes, create a framework for lasting peace and reconciliation.
That sounds like a huge undertaking, especially with a conflict as complex as this one. I mean, what would you say are some key steps in moving towards a more just and peaceful future?
Well, you're right. It is a daunting task, but I don't think it's impossible. Throughout history, there are so many examples of communities that have been torn apart by conflict and managed to find a path to peace. It often starts with dialogue, reconciliation, forgiveness. It's a long and difficult journey, but it all begins with that first step.
And in this case, what do you think that first step looks like? Where do we even begin when there's so much distrust and animosity?
I think it begins with recognizing the humanity of the other side. It's about remembering that behind all the political labels and ideologies, there are individuals with hopes and dreams and fears just like us.
It's easy to get caught up in all the rhetoric and forget that there are real people on both sides who are suffering.
Exactly.
It sounds like empathy plays a crucial role in bridging that divide.
It's essential. Empathy is about stepping outside of our own limited perspectives and trying to understand the experiences of those on the other side. Their suffering is just as real and valid as our own.
But acknowledging their humanity doesn't mean condoning the violence or injustice, right? There needs to be a balance between empathy and accountability.
Absolutely. Holding perpetrators accountable is still crucial. But true justice, it encompasses more than just punishment. It's about restoring dignity, addressing grievances, creating that framework for a more equitable and peaceful future.
And that's a process that involves all of us. Engaging in meaningful dialogue, challenging our own biases, working towards a shared vision where peace isn't just a dream, but a reality.
Exactly. Breaking that cycle of violence,
Sure.
interrupting the patterns of retaliation, creating a space where healing and reconciliation can actually take root. It's not about taking sides, it's about recognizing our shared humanity and understanding that the pursuit of justice and peace, really two sides of the same coin.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a mix of hope and concern. The challenges are immense, the path forward is definitely unclear, but the human capacity for resilience, for compassion, for forgiveness, it gives me reason to believe that peace is possible, even if it feels distant right now. What are your final thoughts for our listeners?
I agree with you. And I truly believe that by engaging in these difficult conversations, grappling with the complexities, holding on to hope even in the darkest of times, we can all contribute to building a more just and peaceful world. Even if our individual contributions seem small, they all add up to something much greater. And as you continue to reflect on all of this, think about this. If the digital age is making it harder to hide these atrocities and escape accountability, will that lead to a more cautious approach to warfare? Or will it simply force those in power to find new ways to operate in the shadows? It's a question that will continue to shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.
It really is a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Challenge your assumptions. Seek out diverse perspectives. The pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a lifelong journey, and it's one we need to undertake if we want to create a better future for ourselves and generations to come.